ground was shaded by a giant oak tree that was impossible for anybody to climb without the assistance of the adjacent rusty chain link fence, which offered a dependable boost to the first branch for the tall and crazy kids who dared to teeter on the fence while reaching perilously for the low branch in acts of bravado that seem small now but were legendary back then. And under the giant oak, the parents would also sit on benches or they would lean against the rusty fence, and they would trade stories about the joys and challenges of immigrant life. Carpools were organized under the tree. Recipes were traded, and tips on how to use the commercial washers in the laundromat were exchanged. Strangers became friends, friends became family, and the cycle would continue as new residents moved in. Under that single oak tree, we encountered God through the hospitality of people who would soon move back home, never to be heard from or seen again. We were all travelers looking for a place to sit down and rest for just a little while. That oak tree reminded me of Abraham's journey to the oak tree that was beside the oaks of Mamre. But that journey started all the way back in Genesis chapter 12. God told Abraham there to get up and go from your country and your kindred to a land that I will show you. So Abraham, he picked up all of his belongings and he left his ancestral home and he began traveling. And first he went to the land of Canaan, and then he went to the hill country that was east of Bethel. And from Bethel, he went to Negeb. And from Negeb, he went to Egypt. And then in Egypt, he had a run-in with Pharaoh over Abraham's wife. So he went back to Negeb. And he wasn't there long before he had another run-in, this time with his nephew Lot. They decided to go their separate ways after a big argument over how to handle competing herdsmen in the region. At this point in the story, Abraham and Sarah have earned enough frequent camel miles for gold medallion status. They have traveled in circles at God's command. And they've picked up and they've pitched camp so many times that we would forgive them now if they both rolled their eyes when God commanded them to move one more time, this time to the oaks of Mamre, which is where we find Abraham this morning, sitting outside at the entrance of his tent. He's silent and he's still, and his head is tilted slightly downward in the manner of someone who has grown accustomed to waiting for time to pass and for prayers to be answered. And the text says that he looked up immediately when he saw three men standing nearby, and we're told that one of them was God, but the identity of the surprise visitor is withheld from Abraham at first. He doesn't know who he's welcoming. Nonetheless, Abraham's enthusiastic response to the sudden appearance of three strangers is exactly what you would expect from someone who has spent all of his retirement traveling through unfamiliar and foreign lands at the command of God, entirely dependent on the good graces of people he met along the way. In the ancient Near East, the protection of guests was certain. And so when an individual household would welcome people that passed through, the whole community was expected to do the same, to do anything other than open up your door wide and prepare a lavish meal, kill the fatted calf, insist that your guests go and rest under the tree so that they could wash their feet and stay a while. To do anything less than all of this would have been dishonorable. It would have brought shame upon your family and also upon your village. So Abraham doesn't know who God is in this story yet, but in verse 9, the guests ask where Sarah is, and so we discover the strangers know her name, and Abraham does as well. This would indicate to Abraham that these three guests are not on the way to somewhere else. They're not just passing through. They didn't come from up north or down south. Their destination was Abraham's tent. That was the only place that they were traveling, and they arrived that day to seal a covenant through Abraham between God and all of humanity, including us, who are gathered here on this Lord's day. And then in verse 10, it's revealed to Abraham and Sarah that the sign of the covenant, the signal that they will know it's true, would be the miraculous birth of a child to Abraham and Sarah at the ages of 199 respectively. And they'll name their son Isaac. And he and Rebekah will marry, and their children will be Esau and Jacob. Their other son, Ishmael, will travel away with his mother Hagar. Through Esau and Jacob and through them and the generations that follow, a whole multitude of people, including us who are gathered here on this day, will grow to live in obedience and faith to the God who found rest and refuge under an old oak tree in the middle of nowhere. Now, the oak was there before God told Abraham and Sarah to settle beside it. This oak was special. The oak was there before God and the two traveling partners set out to surprise Abraham and Sarah with a promise of new life. The oak was there before Abraham looked up at the entrance of his tent and noticed that he wasn't alone. The oak was there before Abraham eagerly said, let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. The story of promise birthed under an oak in Genesis 18 does not pause to explain to us how the oak came to be before anyone knew to find shade under it. The tree is just there, waiting, ready, eager to sit still and eavesdrop as God greets humanity under the cover of its leafy branches. The winds planted that tree. Even before Abraham and Sarah, creation shimmied one day and the winds blew and a single acorn the size of your thumbnail dropped from a neighboring tree in the Mamre forest, and it scooted across the dry, hostile, rocky ground, and it settled in a spot where the perfect combination of sun and soil and nutrients allowed the wind-chased acorn to grow over many generations from a seedling to a sapling and then a tree thing. And the oak that hosted God, it wasn't supposed to be there. You'll notice that Abraham settled by the oaks of Mamre, not in them. We know he wasn't in a forest of trees because verse 1 of our reading notes that he was exposed to the heat of the day, which is hard to do if you're in the middle of a forest. And we know he wasn't in a forest of trees because in verse 4, he invites God to rest under the tree. The tree is the only one that's around. Additional instructions are not necessary. Abraham didn't say, rest under one of the trees over there. He didn't say, pick a tree, any one. The oak that hosted God was not one of several. It was alone, planted on purpose by the mysterious movement of creation's untamable winds. It wasn't supposed to be there, but it was. And it was anchored to the earth by irrepressible roots stretching down and then out in a multi-generational quest to find water in preparation for the day when maybe, potentially, possibly, God would visit. The oak that hosted God reminds me of the churches in Lalibela. Lalibela is in the western highlands of Ethiopia. I visited that small town 9 years ago on a church pilgrimage I took. The 11 churches of Lalibela were constructed over the course of 500 years between the 7th and 12th centuries. Now, old churches are always interesting to me. I like to just look at the architecture and wonder about the stories of the people that built them. But these churches that are still in use today, even by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, they're just built different. Each one was carved out of a single piece of rock. And so instead of rising up from the ground, these churches descend down. And the churches are an engineering and architectural and mathematical marvel. and they were all chiseled by hand. And like the hardiness of an oak, the rock of Lalibela is not easy to cut or to chip away at it. If anybody wants to make a trip one day, just let me know. I will gladly return to sit under the cover of rock walls that were carved from the faith of artisans whose names we will never know. The size and the number of the single rock churches is humbling. It takes your breath away. And the architectural detail is stunning. But what I wasn't prepared for was the realization that almost all of the artisans who labored under the heat of the day to break rock and carve rock and move rock, they all died before they worshiped in the sanctuaries that they built. With a single chisel in one hand and a single hammer in the other, the artisans, they held acorns but never got to see the trees. They never saw the multitudes of people that sat still and speechless, made small by the irrepressible wonder of their backbreaking work. And they never saw that Jesus followers from around the world would make pilgrimages for themselves to see what happens when works of faith are expressed without concern for specific outcomes or recognition. And they never saw that the whole world would gather under the branches of trees that they planted. And like Abraham and Sarah, their legacy was what they selflessly left behind. And like Abraham and Sarah, they too would die before the branches of their trees grew long enough and wide enough to host the whole human family for an encounter with God. Do not despair, though. Each one of our hands is holding an acorn of faith. And at our back is a holy wind that will blow just right and just where it needs to go if we let it drop to the ground as a gift back to the earth from which we all came. And before you drop it, though, your acorn that you now hold, count the cost. Oaks like the one that hosted God grow slowly, and you will not be around to determine how your tree is used or who is permitted to meet God under it. And if you're ready to die without knowing what your tree will become, then let it go. Open your hands now even. Let it go. Trees do not grow in pockets or in the palms of our hands. Let it go. All of creation is prepared to offer the soil and the sun and the nutrients your acorn of faith or money or time or love or focus or attention needs to grow big. Let it go, because at a time when we're impatient at the pace of our societal problem-solving processes, maybe we need to remember that not even God created in a single day. Let it go because you hold all of eternity in your hand. Let it go. Bless it. Let it go. As we learned today, even God needs the shade of a tree every once in a while. In the name of God, Creator, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.